Everyone, let's give everyone just a couple minutes to come off the waiting room and then we'll get started. All right, well, I think we have a critical mass, so I'm going to get us started. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. For those who don't know me, my name is Persis Yu. I'm the Deputy Executive Director of the Student Borrower Protection Center. Our mission is to alleviate the burden of student debt for tens of millions of borrowers across the country. It probably goes without saying that at this moment, the student loan system is in utter chaos. The last administration made great strides in improving debt relief programs and delivering cancellation to millions of borrowers. But the long-term efforts were to increase affordability and provide permanent pathways out of debt were thwarted by right-wing states, attorneys general, and corrupt courts, leaving borrowers in a state of absolute disarray with unknown payments and unknown futures. And and instead of increasing opportunities for relief, we saw Congress just pass a massive handout to billionaires off the backs of working families who are drowning in student debt, families who were taken advantage of by low quality programs, families, students who went to online programs run by private companies that operate in the shadows while peddling the names of better known universities. This bill was a gift to profiteers looking to line their pockets off the hopes and dreams of students who wanted to improve their lives. And all the while, the sponsors were claiming to lower the cost of education. But what we know is happening instead of lowering costs, that what's going to happen for everyday working families is their costs are going to increase. And ultimately, it is going to limit access for millions of students across the country and for some of our most vulnerable Black, Brown, and first generation students. So while that is not the sunshine and rainbow, what we are here to do to talk about today is that state of student debt and really highlight some of the research that has gone on. I'm so excited to be joined by my colleagues, Dan, Mark, Stephanie, and Aisa, who will walk through both what is happening in the world, but also what do we know about the state of student debt and the state of these relief programs and what happens to actual students when they actually get that relief as well. So with that, I'm just here. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for coming, for caring and paying attention to this issue. And I'm going to turn it over to Mark Hulsman, who will kick off the formal programming for today. So thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Persis. Really appreciate it. And thank you for that framing of of where we are. I believe you used the terms utter chaos and disarray. So we're going to try to organize that a little bit as much as we can for folks watching us live, and then those who are able to watch this recording later. So thanks to Persis for setting us up, and thanks to everyone for joining today. As Persis mentioned, I'm Mark Hulsman. I am a fellow at SBPC. I'm also the director of policy and advocacy at the Hope Center for Student Basic Needs at Temple University. And I, for one, am really excited about the discussion we're going to have today. So what we're going to try to do is we're going to showcase some ongoing and new research on the state of borrower well-being, both sort of from a financial perspective and a non-financial perspective, and the ways that we know and are learning that student debt relief can improve the lives of borrowers, and what we should be looking out for. So we're going to do that, and then we're going to combine that with a discussion that really aims to take stock of where we are after what has been an absolute fire hose of action, both legislative and executive, sort of as Persis alluded to, very few of which have been designed at all to improve the lives of Americans who hold student loan debt, or lower costs for families to make them more able to get by. So we're going to talk about research, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the state of play for borrowers, for schools, and for states as we navigate, again, as Persis mentioned, the utter chaos and disarray that families are facing. So I'm going to shepherd this discussion. We have some amazing panelists to join me and sound much smarter than me. So I'm in the enviable position to just ask questions and listen. A bit of housekeeping before we do. We're going to try and keep this as conversational and interactive as possible. I know that there's folks who are dealing with first week of school and vacations and stuff like that. So we're going to try to make this as interactive for the recording as possible. So please use the Q&A function if you have a question or a clarification. We're going to try to roll through them as we go. I'll do my best to sort of cruise direct here. And just a request to kind of keep your questions relevant to the discussion at hand, whether that's the research we're going to discuss or some of the areas that the panelists are experts on. And of course, we'll try to link to relevant resources as well in the chat for those who are live. So without further ado, I'm going to bring up the first part of a discussion where we're going to talk to Dan Collier, who is Assistant Professor of Higher and Adult Education in the Department of Leadership at the University of Memphis. Dan, blink twice if I got that right. Dan's also a research fellow for Davidson's College, the College Crisis Initiative, and the Student Loan Law Initiative at the University of California, which partners with SPPC on a number of great stuff. But more importantly, Dan's a longtime research expert on student debt and higher education financing. I'm really excited to have a little nerdy fireside chat with him about his ongoing research that uses, really one of the most unique data sets that documents borrower experiences. So without further ado, let's chat, Dan. So I guess my first sort of question is, you've led what I think is kind of really some of the most compelling and insightful research on how student loan borrowers are interacting with and experiencing debt relief programs, right? Those that still exist on the books, like public service loan forgiveness or IDR. Can you just, for the folks who are maybe unfamiliar, give a quick introduction to your existing research and scholarship on PSLF and IDR cancellation, how the sort of data set and the research you're doing adds to the existing literature and kind of gives us a wider sense of the impact of these programs, both financial and sort of non-financial?
Sure. So we'll start chronologically with the work here. So some of my early work, I took the survey of consumer finances and figured out who was in income-driven repayment. I've done that twice. We're doing it a third time right now. We're just waiting for the data to come out. We've been a little bit slow on that. And one of the original questions I had about income-driven repayments, who's in it? Yes, we know higher balances. That makes sense. But then beyond the balances, when you start interacting variables and demographics and whatnot, and wages and other factors, who are in these programs? Because it's sort of important to know when we're designing these programs. And overwhelmingly, it looks like that women are more likely than men to be in these programs. And now we have even stronger evidence in their last batch that minoritized individuals are more likely to be in income-driven repayment. Now, interestingly, those who have middle earnings, like legit middle earners as individuals, excuse me, are likely to be in income-driven repayment. So there's this narrative, there's been this long narrative that there's this savvy borrower that exists, and it's true. Some savvy borrowers do exist. Some savvy borrowers are smart enough to put all of their as much as they can in IRAs or 401ks that are, and so it lowers their burden to repay if they're in income-driven repayment and stuff like that. But that's rare. Most of the individuals are just middle earners trying to survive and trying to get rid of their debts over the course of time, which again, you alluded to that the recent Republican bill have extended their timelines on these individuals, on many of them. So that was the first jump into it for me because I wanted to know who was in it and I wanted to influence that conversation. I've been fortunate enough to, although it's not quite that conversation wasn't influenced quite as well as I hoped it to in the mass media a little bit more because all they focus on is how much student loan debt exists, not why it exists or who else would be in these programs based on that debt. Some outlets did pick it up, but it just never stuck for everything like I had hoped it to. Um, but then thinking about this issue, like what are people's experiences here? What we know that there's financial pain. We know that is financial distress. What is the difference between an individual saying they live paycheck to paycheck versus actually living paycheck to paycheck? Because a lot of us feel that way, even though compared to other people, we're really not, right? But and then what is it like? Another popular conversation point is, well, X person's making $120,000. That should be fine. They're in the upper echelons of the American workforce, or as far as earnings go. But what does that mean in Jersey, where the median income, a zip code with median income is like 160K? I mean, they're still below it, right? So I wanted to start looking at that and developing some research to think about what that looks like differently than just aggregating all of the credit panel data and going, yeah, that's fine. They should be fine. The answer is a lot of them are fine, but there's very many of them that are not because of different circumstances, because of where they live and the cost of living, and that has an influence on things like their psychological distress. And that's where I'm coming with the crux of my first wave of research. So the first part of the research that I was conducting was from 2022 to 2024. And that focused only on public service loan forgiveness individuals. And what I found were a few interesting things. The first thing is that getting forgiveness or coming closer to forgiveness had nothing to do with job satisfaction or wanting to move, unlike what was alleged in a failed lawsuit by Cato. Um, and but there is a fundamental stress that exists, and it mostly exists when individuals are waiting for a forgiveness decision from the government. There's this liminal zone whenever when they come close to forgiveness, where they're within a year, and there's the stress slows down a little bit because the end of the tunnel exists. But then there's that multiple month to maybe over a year period where people are waiting for a decision from the government and the servicers to say, yes, you got it, or no, you don't. And then there's a lag with that, in that people have told me that they were thinking the government might take it away from them eventually, which, given the way the government has behaved, both administrations, sometimes it's hard to understand what you would be legally entitled to or what is fair and what the government will do in practice. So during that stretch, what we saw were psychological distress basically just spiked up. And psychological distress is the pathway to suicidal ideation. And we saw a lot of 50% of people waiting on a forgiveness decision had suicidal ideation. They thought about suicide at least once per week. That's ridiculous. That is an ungodly amount of individuals thinking about suicide. So then we took all these things, and I'm condensing like 7, 8 papers worth of information in the most compact way I possibly can. So we took all this information and we developed a new survey that we just started collecting data on in 2025. And then we started, we took out some satisfaction, like life satisfaction, because that was tied to psychological distress too closely. So we didn't need that anymore. But we started looking at things like food insecurity. And then we started looking at things, then we started more focusing on suicidal ideation. Because in the first survey, we hid it. We didn't want people knowing that that was an explicit focus of ours, because we didn't want people responding to it a little bit differently than we had, hoped within a matrix of things. But now we want to focus on it. We want to, and we started asking them, did you make plans? Have you attempted suicide? Is there a difference between suicidal ideation and self-harm for you? I mean, you can do things to harm yourself, but not intend to hurt yourself in that similar vein. What does that look like? And how is this all related to your student loan debt and your finances? Additionally, we are looking at some measures of satisfaction with college and what people think that the level of education that they would need for their kids. So again, overview. Now we can talk a little bit more about specifics.
That's great. And yeah, and I think one of the things that I've liked through several of your papers, and I should plug that Dan's research is out and about. You can Google it, but if you go to the Student Loan Law Initiative's website, slli.org. There is a drop-down menu for different publications and research where you can read some of Dan's earlier work, to the 2022 to 2024 work, really looking at sort of these measures of psychological stress and things like that on those who are approaching cancellation. I think, yeah, what you're drawing out is sort of the really just the existential burden facing folks with student loan debt, and it's whether that's sort of the spike in stress when they're close or waiting, and really they're at the mercy of policymakers or servicers, right, to properly enforce or implement the programs that they've been promised, right, that they're entitled to under the law. So I think just keeping that in mind as we go to the sort of state of play for borrowers, that so much of this is dependent on those in power to enforce and implement the laws on the books, and maybe thinking about how we can hasten that process for folks, even when there's even during a chaotic time. So just diving in, I mean, I think you've talked sort of as an overview of like the things you're looking at from a borrower perspective that aren't necessarily like hard measures of financial well-being. What are the things maybe that you found in your research up to this point that are either the most compelling or most surprising to the broader national conversation about student debt? You alluded to some of this, talking about like knowing who is in these programs, right? Middle income borrowers just trying to get by, right? But what are other sort of compelling things that you would like policymakers to understand about student borrowers who are maybe hopefully attaching themselves to these debt relief programs?
So the first thing that comes on the top of my mind is that the lowest earners, like making under $13,000 a year, who might have any level of debt, are not in income-driven repayment. But we know that if you make that least that little amount of money, you're probably really struggling to pay anything back in traditional repayment. And if you look at Sue Dynarski's work, she talks about how those are people likely to default. So IDR could be useful for them, especially. And I know that RAP has a negative connotation for a lot of reasons. For some people, because they just dropped it on borrowers and did a bunch of stuff. But for low income borrowers and who are just starting off without high balances that grew over the course of time, potentially RAP might be okay for them to be in, better than other IDR programs in the past would, because of the addressing of the negative amortization. So that's something that's fair about that. Now there are other issues in that they'll probably be paying more as monthly over time anyways. But again, that's one thing that needs to be focused on. Those individuals need to focus, because those are individuals that are most likely to be defaulting here. And they don't have the same job opportunities that somebody with a master's or a bachelor's degree would, because those are usually people that dropped out of college on average. The other thing to consider is that there's this whole construct of distress, right? Of distress. It's not that, what I'm finding is that student loan debt, whether how much you have remaining in your balance, which is very, very a lot for a lot of people, because negative amortization, people's balances grew over the course of time on them. And that obviously puts a lot of psychological distress on them. And a lot of people try to ignore that, because the only thing that really matters is coming down to, for public service loan forgiveness people, 120 qualifying payments, because then all that goes away. But for income-driven repayment people, a lot longer, but then that's going to grow a lot higher too. But there's stress related to both of these concepts differently. And unfortunately, the stress that exists with your balances, that's either going to remain static, because those balances ain't ever going down for most people in IDR, or it's going to rise. The closer you come to forgiveness, it goes down incrementally until about the 1 year left for forgiveness, and then it plummets. The problem is this sort of evens out, right? You never are able to get, or what we have found in the reports is people are never unable to get unstressed from where we recorded them until forgiveness or close to. So there's a lot of mental distress that exists with this. So you have the concept of financial stress, which is wages, earnings, children, marriage, because marriage is a financial relationship in most cases, right? Dual earners. And then you have student loan debt, mortgage, other things that are push-pull factors, and you have this whole concept of financial distress that exists that plays onto psychological distress, which again flows to something like suicidal ideation and then eventually behaviors. So easing some of these issues, especially with student loan debt, would be very valuable into decreasing psychological distress and financial stress, but it will not solve all of that because the concept itself of financial stress is like a giant mess of things that will you have to disentangle, right? So it's not going to be a solve all, it will just ease things. However, I would say that individuals with high debt loads and especially now, like we can talk about the new data that I sent you in a little bit, but things are not looking really good right now at all. So easing some of these things would be very helpful to individuals.
Yeah, I think that part of that to me and part of the most compelling stuff to me and in what you're talking about is that there's a real power to that, and this is maybe obvious, right? But it's worth saying that there's a real power in removing the debt burden entirely, right? Of cancellation or relief, right? Because it, as you're saying, that psychological or other stress doesn't go away until the debt burden goes away, right? And I think, and the reason I said that is I think that runs really counter to some of the arguments you will often hear on the right over the past decade and a half about IDR that there isn't necessarily a need for cancellation at the end of that if monthly payments remain low, right? If someone's monthly burden is quote unquote reasonable, then they're going to have the sort of same you know it's going to have the same impact on their life than if they had it canceled, right? And I think your research really flies in the face of that, right? So that's something that I take away from that, at least personally. So let's actually talk
So,
about the new research a little bit. Like,
well,
I was
actually,
just,
can I
yeah, go ahead.
respond to that real quickly?
Yeah,
If you want to tax people for X amount of years, X amount of their wages, a lot of people would actually be okay with that because then you don't have the balance, the burdens of the balances on that, right? The problem is higher earners and more affluent individuals with lower debt. I mean, we argued for that system. I mean, Milton Friedman argued for that system in the 50s. The great conservative economist, like, no, we need to do it this way, and lost out that argument. Um, Affluent individuals would not have an opportunity to repay their debts quicker than not because they will, and they don't take as much out. So that leaves everybody else. But if we want to tax individuals X amount of percentage of their discretionary income, most people seem to be fine with that. And then they know for like however many decades, that's what it is. And it's relative to wages and inflation. But we don't carry this balance that precludes me from getting credit. That's the key. The balance precludes people from getting credit, or
right.
if they get credit, it's crappy credit. It's higher interest rates for nothing. Like they didn't do anything. They could be repaying their bills perfectly fine all the time, but it doesn't matter because you have that huge debt to income ratio that they waived for a little bit, and now it's not.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's the burden itself, it's the balance itself that is the thing, right? And I think that there seems to be no way of getting around that. So I no, it's a great point. So let's talk about the new research, right? Like, I mean, I think that there's new, obviously we're entering this new, I'll say brave new era of student loan debt, right? But you're both um, tracking borrower experiences now and with some new variables, right? So talk about what you're finding now in your initial wave, maybe how people can get involved. It's still ongoing, right? So I want to give folks a chance to either participate or sort of share widely.
Yeah, so we are collecting a new wave of data. We started early in 2025 and we're going all the way through 2025, so a full year of data collection. Right now, we have about 1,600 usable profiles, which is pretty nice. I would like to get that up closer to five, even higher to 10,000, which would be great. And I'm giving multiple talks on this, and hopefully, I know that a bunch of cities and other places are sharing. So in this round of data, collection. We're looking for anybody that was in public service loan forgiveness, meaning they're in it now or they had their debts forgiven, or income driven repayment. Everybody that fits those parameters are welcome. So please invite people. Again, this time around, we're looking at other factors here. For example, we're still looking at stress, and we're seeing a difference between the early part of the data collection, so from January to May and from May to now. January to May, people were a lot more comfortable with their situations. It sort of mimics like the post-pause effect of Biden, where it wasn't as good during the pause because obviously people were starting to repay and starting to get stressed, but it wasn't what we're seeing now. And just some high level, or it's just some low level descriptive stats here. I'm seeing 69% of individuals, and again, 1,600 people. It's not a small sample. It's not a huge sample either. But I expect that these trends would probably stick around because once you get to a couple thousand, it doesn't really move that much. 69% are stressed about personal finances. 49% are stressed about repaying bills. 67% have a larger and extreme amount of stress of finances, and 46% have a larger extreme amount of stress for their student loans. These are much higher than we had in the past. Again, we are collecting food insecurity, and one stat that I do want to bring out because I haven't run the full scale to make sure how food insecure everybody is. But 21% of individuals here suggest that they are cutting meals, which is higher than the national average for adults, and median age is 42. Um, Beyond that, I think we have a big problem coming our way. Um, of the full sample, 19% have reported having any self-harm. So that's self-harm, not suicidal harm, cutting themselves, however they wanted to define self-harm. Uh, 20% have suicidal ideation, though. It's close to our original sample at 19%, so that's not as alarming as I thought it would have been. But the key here is that of the individuals who have reported self-harm, 27% of them have made plans. 10% of them have made attempts. That is extremely high. Of people with suicidal ideation, 37% of them have made plans. 13% of them have attempted suicide. That is, again, extremely large. That is not what we would have expected to see for suicidal ideation at all. That is beyond. That is it's just beyond. And again, the difference between the first part and the second part, staggering. So I have to pull up your email because I have the second part in your email. But there is what's pulling down these percentages are the first part of the year before everything went into effect with Donald Trump and the Department of Education and their inefficiencies and their intentions. Additionally, the GOP changing student loan IDR plans on people, and on top of that, garnishing wages and stuff like that. Like there's been a lot that's happened since that time frame.
Yeah, and that's I mean that the important thing will be to see how people feel moving forward as the effects of the reconciliation bill, which we're going to talk about in a minute, it really come into full focus, right? I mean, I think there's been such an overwhelming set of actions, sort of on the non-student loan side that it's a I'm looking forward to your research and others sort of telling us what the impact of that really profoundly awful piece of legislation is going to do on borrower experiences. So I actually want to take a step back from this before we sort of move forward, and that a lot of what your data is, what we're talking about now is student debt and the impact of it on people's perception of their own finances and daily lives as borrower experiences, right? But I think obviously given the place that higher ed fits in the national conversation and culture right now, I'm wondering what your data can tell us, or what your research can tell us about what this means for people's perceptions of higher education and the value of higher ed, right? So like, whether that's people who have had positive experiences with cancellation, right? With IDR, with PSLF, with sort of getting this burden off of them and what they feel about their own higher ed experiences or their families, or those who haven't, right? And what that means, because I think too often we're not linking the experience with student debt and the perception of this sector, which is obviously under attack and in flux, and from a funding and culture war perspective, but is so important for economic mobility, right? So talk a little bit about how we connect those and maybe what your data says about that.
Yeah, so most of the people in the sample right now have a master's degree, just like they did in the previous work, which makes sense. You know, that's where we're going to be at with IDR on average. About 40% of them reported that the minimum level of education needed for other family members, so people close to them, for their financial security, 40% said a bachelor's. 25% said a trade certificate or degree. So that that breaks down the narratives, and there's another stat in just a moment I'll cite to you. That breaks down the narratives that well-educated individuals on average would trash the trades, like it loves to be said. That's not true. People covet the trades, and that's at least the starting point for what a lot of individuals want for their children. And that might also be influenced by other wider economic concerns right now too. But you know, this is just a stat. And then about 20% say a master's degree is, which we know that might be a little bit overkill on average. But you know, this is again the security. So more money would make them more secure, and we know that people with master's degree would generally earn more money and have more other securities over the course of time. So um, now, when we ask things like, was college worth it to these individuals? And remember, these are individuals with a high degree of distress, with a high degree of uncertainty, with a high degree of suicidal ideation and self-harm ideation. 76% of them said college was worth it for them. 49 or 55% said that they want their kids to have at least a trades or associate's degree. 53% want them to go to get a four-year degree. 78 said college was important to their lives. So you're seeing they understand the value, and it's a lot of times when we talk about like um, sh changing colleges or culture warrior stuff, we don't ask them if what they're going to do for their kids, because of course their kids are going to go to college of some sort, right? And they understand that trades are also college. We ask people what should happen to colleges, and they're not thinking about their kids. They're thinking about the little jackass down the street they don't like. So, you know, or anybody else. And so it's important to personalize these things for individuals so they can also be like, well, all right, yes, this would in this instance for my child, for my close family members, this is something that I would want for them.
Yeah, the for thee but not for me, or for me but not for the phenomenon. I am struck though, and you know, I don't want to, you know, parse the numbers too. I don't want to slice them too thinly here, but you know, the fact that half say they want their kid to go to a four-year school is interesting to me, right? I think that again, and you know, it obviously that's going to depend on how close their, you know, their how old their kids are, their offspring is, right? That, you know, it sort of obviously is going to depend on a number of factors, but it is interesting. I mean, so I guess, you know,
Well, when if I
yeah,
might talk about that for a minute.
yeah.
Uh, Again, the average person in our sample has a master's degree, then followed by a bachelor's degree and a bunch of other. So a lot of these people have at least a four-year, or they will have at least a four-year degree. So it makes sense that they would want their children on average to go. But a lot of where these larger debt loads have come from is because of graduate school and the way that we have sold graduate school. And I'm guilty of that. I work in a graduate program only. But the way we have sold graduate school, especially at graduate schools that charge 40, 50, $60,000 a year, or programs that do without a fair return. But there are also some programs that exist, like law and medical school, that we need individuals that are not only affluent in them, so we can do these things for other individuals. And that's where a lot of the super big balances come from. So, but going to a four-year college still isn't that much. I'm not saying it's not a burden. I want to be clear about that, but it's not the same kind of burden that we're talking about with, you know, on average $100,000 plus a debt.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, and I was going to say that about, you know, the fact that about half are saying they don't want their kid to go to a four-year school. It's you know, it's interesting.
Oh,
Again, you know, it's a that's an interesting data point, you know, sort of given their sort of, you know, their experience with that, obviously, whether that's masters or otherwise. Um,
yeah, I think a lot of that has to do with with current narratives too. I mean, there is a I would have to look at the difference between the first part and the second part, because we know that, or we have seen evidence of a white collared layoff across many various sectors. So I'm going to guess that a lot of these people are paying attention to what's going on in the world. higher education, the more you tend to pay attention to these things, and probably like, the better choice might be the trades for now, but maybe not. And again, this is at least a trades degree and whatnot. So what most people really want, even like again, working class family, that's where I came from. Trades. I was supposed to go do the same thing my dad did, mechanic, or do the same thing my stepdad did, cop, one of the two. And trust me, nobody wanted me to be a cop when I was in my younger 20s. Nobody. That would have been bad for everybody. But what most people want are pathways forward to different steps. Yes, get a trades degree, but also can that access a 4-year degree without having to go back to zero?
Yeah, it's sorry, I was envisioning you're the Dan in law enforcement.
It would have been bad, dude. Bad, terrible for everybody.
So just I'm gonna ask one more question. I'm gonna get you out of here before our panel to sort of try to
Mhm.
link this and what we're experiencing, what borrowers are experiencing to what we're experiencing from a policy perspective. So, obviously this system is in major flux, right? Like some programs, PSLF remain on the books, although it's extremely clear this administration is not interested in administering, existing debt relief avenues, right? The other avenues, IDR, you mentioned the repayment assistance plan or RAP are about to see major changes. We're going to talk a little bit about that on the next panel, but sort of as we stand on the precipice, what in your research most worries you about the current state of affairs and in the coming years? Like, what should we be paying attention to immediately, and what matters for really the functioning of our higher education system, broadly?
So, a few things. Uncertainty is the number one driver of psychological distress, according to my work. Uncertainty. That's why the waiting on forgiveness individuals, 50+% of them have suicidal ideation. Uncertainty right now, as we're measuring it, it is cratered. So I'm going to give you stats from the full sample, and then I want to give you stats from the second half of the sample, from May to now. The full sample, 17% of individuals said that they have trust in their loan servicer and that they trust that there's clarity from the loan servicer in order to repay their debts properly. 15% of them said they had trust in the federal guidance. So, there's no real trust in the federal government. And that started cratering after Biden and the SAVE injunction, and Biden just like silent, not really giving much guidance about that. That administration, despite how they put my work on a platform to help borrowers, and I will always appreciate that. But toward the end, that administration just left borrowers hanging because they wanted SAVE to go and they didn't want people to flow away from SAVE, right? That's just, and then they stopped communicating at the end. 64% of individuals say they have uncertainty and confusion when repaying their loan debt because there's no information. Now, that's the full sample. That was with people that started off in the first year to May. From May to now, I trust my current loan servicer with either strongly agree or agree, right? So we're just agreeing that this is the thing that we can agree that exists. 8% out of like 900 people. I trust my servicer provides me with clear information. 9%. I trust the federal government's guidance regarding the student loans. 6%. I trust the federal government provides clear information. 6%. And the last one, I feel uncertainty and confusion when paying my student loans. 84%. So the first part of this survey, those individuals who were either took the original survey and other people I invited for a couple of months, are propping up the statistics in the whole, or if you just put them all together, it's about half of what it used to be. And uncertainty was already high, right? They didn't trust anybody to begin with. 20% of people saying that we trust the people that we need to be trusting here is ridiculously low. But it's halved since then. It's cratered. And it's not going to get any better because the Department of Ed, not really great at communicating. This one's worse than probably all of them because they want to kill it anyways, but this administration builds no trust with anybody, and the local policymakers or the national representatives are not doing anything to help borrowers at all. I mean, there are some people like them saying we need to do things. Well, great, try anything. Just try anything. It's great. We need to do things. And I personally recognize that they have limited power in doing things, but come up with a plan, put that plan out forward, tell the borrowers what you're going to do. I personally think, and I'll get out of here now, but I personally think in the future that all of this uncertainty is going to it's going to engage in a lot of harm for a lot of people. And I don't mean just suicide. I mean retracting from family. I mean severing bonds. I mean plummeting the birth rate even lower. Like I have evidence that the student loan debt pause was super beneficial to educated individuals having more kids or having their kid for the first time, right? Um, it's going to have huge ripple effects with like I know it's not 42 million, but it's going to be tens of millions of borrowers, and these are people that are high up in how much they pay in taxes. So if they start retreating from things, if they start becoming less effective at work, they start getting fired because they're depressed and they're suicidal, and they just are less productive. That's going to harm us all too financially if we want to go down that route. But that's harming everybody socially.
Yeah, I mean the uncertainty and the chaos, right, is much of as much of this as the sort of intentionally destructive policy design. Um, Dan, I want to thank you, and we will link to obviously we've linked a little bit to Dan's research for folks who want to check it out. The data is ongoing, and obviously the next several months are crucial to understanding what folks are experiencing. So thanks, Dan. Stick around. We might have some questions for you. But with that, I want to bring up our panel to sort of sift through some of the confusion. So we're going to talk a little bit about the state of student debt, right? For borrowers, what borrowers need to know, what states can be doing, how we hold schools accountable in this uncertain time. I luckily have three amazing experts here to help us get a sense of where things are and what comes next. I'm going to do super quick introductions. Many of these folks don't need introductions, so I'll go quick. Aisa Control-Ibanez is the policy director at SPPC. Candace Lofton is counsel at SPPC, and Stephanie Hall, like me, is a fellow at SPPC. So obviously, we're gonna chat through some of this. Again, we're gonna try to keep it as conversational as possible. I'll popcorn some questions to each of you, but obviously, if anyone has sort of insights that they'd like to share, feel free to do so. I want to start with let's start with Aisa. So, we've talked a little bit about the state of repayment, right, for borrowers, and I don't want to belabor this point, but the last 8 months have been probably the most confusing, chaotic, and destructive periods for those with student loan debt that we've ever seen, right? Now that the dust has sort of settled on some of the initial administrative actions, reconciliation in particular, obviously there's more to go and more that we're constantly vigilant about, but what, from your perspective, are the provisions or policies that you think need to be most front and center for borrowers and advocates? What do we need to be vigilant about right now for the next year or two to really mitigate some of the harm for borrowers?
Yes, thank you so much, Mark. And that is definitely an understatement in terms of just the pure chaos that has been happening and coming out of this administration. And the reality is that the Republican-led Congress just passed legislation making really unprecedented cuts to our nation's safety net programs, and that includes higher education, the higher education system, and financial aid that so many students and families rely on to make their college dreams come true. And so when I was thinking about, just trying to think about what the provisions that kind of keep me up at night for the next year or two, really kind of the way I think about them is kind of what this bill means for how students and families are going to pay for college on the front end and how folks are going to manage to pay down their debt on the back end. And so, this one big beautiful bill, or what how we refer to it, the one big terrible law, the reality is that it is going to make paying for college much more expensive and much more risky. And many of the provisions that will directly result in this is the fact that this new law really limits how much federal loan assistance students and families can take on to pay for their education. So we know the new law eliminates the Graduate Plus Loan Program, which was the sole program that was dedicated to helping students pursue graduate and professional level education. The law also limits how much parents can take on to help their dependent children pay for college. And then on top of that, sets lifetime limits for how much students across the board can take on, right? You know, and what will this mean? And we, you know, really see this, you know, we really see kind of three different scenarios happening. We're going to see students and families pushed into the private market, where we know products are going to be harder to access, where products are more expensive and come with less consumer protections, and pathways to forgiveness, as we've seen with federal loans. We also know that for folks who have the means and have, you know, access to cosigners, et cetera, you know, they will be fine. But for most of the students that we need to really be paying attention to, the folks who are first generation, the lowest income folks, the folks who are not able to access cosigners, you know, access to this type of private lending is going to be very difficult. And if they are able to get something, it's going to be much more expensive, and much riskier. So likely to be subprime products that have incredibly higher interest rates, and have dire consequences for borrowers should they fall behind. And so I think, you know, we are going to see folks pushed into these more riskier products in order to pay for college. Or the third scenario is that we're going to see students and families abandon higher ed altogether, which I think is not just a loss for that individual student or that individual family. It's a loss for an entire community, for our states, for our local economies, for our nation, as a whole. And so, you know, I think on the front end, you know, the fact that this law really limits how much folks can access in terms of resources to pay for college on the front end, is really alarming. And you know, it's important to also recognize that the bill does nothing to really cap how much schools can charge students and families in terms of, you know, tuition and fees, et cetera. And you know, at a time where states are going to be facing massive budget shortfalls, you know, and other cuts in the bill, you know, are going to exacerbate, you know, cuts to Medicaid, cuts to SNAPs, they're going to exacerbate the challenges that states are having in their budget situations. And as a result, you know, we know historically that states have been forced to cut higher ed budgets when they are in these circumstances. And so not only are students and families going to have less financial aid to lean on, they're going to see higher ed costs increase because of these kind of state cuts that are going to, you know, increase tuition, increase fees across the board. So that's just on the front end, the stuff that kind of keeps me up at night. But also just the changes to the repayment system writ large, where, and you had mentioned this, Mark, you know, a lot of these decisions are going to happen in real time through negotiated rulemaking, et cetera. But I mean, the gutting of income-driven repayment options, and the creation of this new RAP plan that is going to be more expensive for the vast majority of borrowers, that now requires borrowers to be in repayment for 30 years as opposed to 20 and 25 years. So increasing the amount of time that borrowers have to struggle, that borrowers could fall into the cracks, that borrowers could experience servicing failures, that is very dangerous as well. And also, you know, the fact that through this new plan, borrowers are going to be required to make, you know, $10 minimum payments. Now, on its face, that might not seem like a big deal, but I think Dan's research really helps shed light on, for the folks who are the lowest income borrowers who should have been able to benefit from a $0 monthly payment, that $10 a month is going to be the difference between them staying afloat and then potentially falling into default after, you know, a certain amount of time, you know, after a long amount of time that they have not been able to make payments and keep up with that. And so I think, you know, the fact that not only are we making college harder, more expensive, more risky, we are literally making it even harder for the folks who are just trying to responsibly repay their loans. And that should be, I forget what the terminology is, the third flight sounding alarm, or that should sound alarms for everybody, because it certainly keeps me up at night and is very depressing to have seen that this is what Congress did, literally on the backs of students and families to pay for tax cuts for billionaires.
I was wondering what metaphor you were going to grasp
really
for there. I
could not remember. I'm so sorry.
No, it was, you got there. We landed it. Yeah, I mean, like, just to connect it to Dan's piece, right? The sort of what we're doing is effectively, by disinvesting, by making it, you know, sort of more punitive to attend higher ed, we're going to be thrusting more people into a system that, you know, creates that burden, right? That debt burden that until it is gone, holds such sway over people's lives, and we're making it harder to get repayment, right? I think that the 30-year cancellation time frame, is again one of the more pernicious things, right? Because it's just delaying, so far out the opportunity to relieve yourself of that burden, right? So thanks for that. Other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play? Let me turn to Stephanie and then to Candace, because I want to talk about, obviously we're talking about what Congress has done and what this administration is not doing for borrowers, or doing on the backs of borrowers. Stephanie, I think we're talking, we've talked about sort of the borrower experience and what the federal government is doing, but I want to talk to you because you've done so much work about the state of schools, right? The state of, in some cases, the programs behind the schools, the school behind the school. You've done so much work over the past several years examining kind of the influence of different actors, private, often for-profit actors within our public system, whether that's OPMs, for-profit colleges, others, and kind of the need for oversight, in this space. Not to continue the sort of what keeps you up at night questions, but what keeps you up at night about the sort of state of the fight to hold these actors and programs accountable? Where are we, right? What should we be looking out for, on the horizon over the next couple years in the areas that you focused on with regard to schools themselves, or sort of programming behind the schools that can load up students with debt or sort of leave them hanging?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. What keeps me up at night, though, is I don't think we can expect any sort of federal oversight of compliance with the Higher Education Act when it comes to institutions making misrepresentations to students. And that comes in for me when I've been looking at the business models within the American higher ed system. So hundreds of public and nonprofit colleges have outsourced program marketing, student recruitment to private for-profit companies. We often call them OPMs, like Mark just mentioned, online program management companies. And they are paid based on how many students they convince to apply and that eventually enroll. And that practice is banned by federal law because of how it incentivizes predatory and misleading behavior, because a recruiter who's paid per successful recruit may feel the need to say or do whatever they need to do to get a student to seek enrollment, including misrepresenting the program or how much it costs or its outcomes. And on top of all of that, the student is usually kept in the dark about the fact that they're talking with a third party and not with their dream school's actual admissions office. So I should note that this is not a practice of these colleges on-campus admissions offices, but because of a loophole in the federal ban on incentive compensation, many colleges choose to expose their prospective online students to these consumer abuses, and that's what keeps me up. That loophole originates from a set of sub-regulatory guidance that is many years old now, and it's on shaky legal footing and should be rescinded. Over the past few years, the Department of Ed issued guidance to clarify the parameters that colleges should follow when outsourcing, but unfortunately, they did not rescind that guidance. It's still in place. So at the federal level, students are not protected from what can come from recruitment contracts that are based on incentive comp. The concealment of those contracts is also something to keep in mind. If you're a student looking around at different online master's degrees, for example, you could be in communication with these service providers who are basically masquerading as university employees and not realize it. And I'll sort of like kind of wrap it up there, but there are things that states can do, and some states have stepped up to do so, thankfully, to at least bring some more transparency for students and to protect students from that predatory enrollment scenario.
Yeah, it's so important. Like you said, it's, from a consumer perspective, it's not, it's the thing behind the thing that you're interacting with, and maybe it can be so opaque. So obviously, if there's no federal interest in oversight, we're gonna have to rely on states, right? So I want to go back to, in a second, Stephanie talking about what states are doing there, but Candace, to bring you into the conversation, just to sort of, start on the states piece here. obviously there's such a role in our higher ed system and our consumer protection system for states to protect students and borrowers through state consumer protection laws, through sort of other avenues. Um, you know, can we, and also that there's, I guess I'll bring in the fact that there's other forms of interaction with higher education financing that isn't just the more punitive federal student loan system, right? There's non-traditional financing mechanisms, that folks enter into, right? And you've done a lot of work, and SBPC has done a lot of work on some of these programs, like training repayment arrangement provisions, or TRAPS, right? Talk a little bit about these sort of alternate forms of debt, right? That people can fall into. Talk a little about your work in this area. How can local or state regulators use their authorities that still exist to address some of the abuses in the kind of non-federal student loan space, and dealing with some of these programs?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mark. So like Mark mentioned, we have done a lot of research and advocacy against the use of TRAPS, or training repayment agreement provisions. These are a form of stay or pay contracts that pretty much requires a worker to either stay at their job for a certain amount of time, or if they choose to leave, or if they're forced to leave, they may be required to pay their employer back, usually an absurd amount of money, for trainings that are typically dubious and are not transferable to another job. And so they don't hold any real value for the worker. Recently, like the last decade, these agreements have become more prevalent, and we've seen them pop up more and more in different spaces, from aerospace to tech boot camps, and even in like grooming camps like PetSmart. So we've been really active in encouraging state officials and state actors to get involved in these areas and use their state consumer and worker protection laws to protect workers and to advocate for them. We've also urged state actors to use state debt collection and state usury laws whenever it gets to that point where employers are trying to collect on these debts that are not debts from their workers. We've encouraged them to use these laws and pretty much hold these employers accountable for being predatory and trying to trap people into these debts and hold them captive for way too long. We've seen these debts rise to $20,000, and people are scared because they have reported them to debt creditors. And they've been forced to repay these debts. So we often encourage state actors to use state laws at their disposal already to protect workers.
I love that. So jumping off, and Stephanie and Candace, this to you, but obviously Aisa, feel free to jump in, right? So obviously there's laws on the books. There's state consumer laws on the books. Stephanie, you mentioned how, states can do some their stuff around transparency in particular, but what is the role of states in protecting students and borrowers now, right? We have, we're seeing sort of the early impacts of this reconciliation bill. We can talk a little bit about what states can do maybe to mitigate some of the funding harm we're going to see come down the line, and the pressures, the cost pressures and the fiscal pressures on higher ed through, indirectly the cuts to Medicaid and SNAP, which are going to kind of blow a hole in states' budgets. But just in terms of like consumer protection, transparency, communication, right? With borrowers and students, what can we do now? What should we be doing? And maybe what are states already doing that should sort of be a model for what we can do moving forward? That's to anybody.
I'm happy to jump in for a sec. I think the federal actions have really put an unfair burden on students to be smart shoppers right now, against a backdrop of really sophisticated scam culture. But really, like any would-be college students, no matter the program they're considering, they need to do as much comparison shopping as they can. And again, this is a losing structure. Comparison shopping for anything these days is very difficult, since internet search results prioritize like advertisements and selling over handing over information. Regarding OPMs and these third-party companies that are operating behind the scenes of a lot of degree programs and boot camp programs, a couple of states have stepped up to pass laws where Minnesota last year passed a law to prohibit their schools from using incentive compensation in the way I described earlier. Ohio just passed a law that will require more transparency. New Jersey has considered similar legislation in the past. California has at least done a statewide audit of, which of their campuses are using these providers. So for the time being, it's really up to states to do this work. We, as advocates and consumer protection-minded folks, are relying on them. That's not good from an equity perspective because it does leave students in certain states more vulnerable. So, that gives us that opening to look forward to rebuilding a federal oversight mechanism as well.
To add to that, like Stephanie says, states have the power to regulate and make student loan companies hold licenses to act in their state. They can regulate interest rates, they can dictate customer service, how they operate. They can also use their UDAP authorities if they're being deceptive and abusive towards consumers and students. So we often encourage states to use those laws against student loan servicers and other predatory actors like for-profit institutions.
I would just also add that, similarly to how we've seen some states step up and combat kind of the growth of these kind of predatory OPM actors that we see kind of operating in states, we do have thankfully seen a lot of momentum in the states for legislation to really rein in the use of traps. So we in California have a piece of legislation that would ban the use of certain stay or pay contracts, including traps, and really strengthen the authority of the Attorney General to enforce laws in the states to protect these workers. I know there's also momentum in New York as well, and so we've been really proud to see states really step up to the plate and protect workers from these kinds of growing and very shady employment kind of arrangements that ultimately just saddle more working families with more forms of debt. And so it's definitely great to see states step up, but to Stephanie's point, there is an equity component here in that, where you live should not determine the protections and the dignity that you have as a working person in this country. And unfortunately, the actions of this administration is really kind of setting up that case to be, or that reality to be the case.
Yeah, and I think just to bring it back to the conversation about folks' perceptions of the value of higher ed and sort of how they want to pass through that system, either themselves or their children, right? I think that part of the worry here, from my perspective, is as we're sort of making the system of higher ed less accessible, right, through funding cuts, we're making it more punitive to repay, right, or less accessible, on the front end and also more punitive on the back end to repay. Dan sort of alluded to this, the draw of other ways to get education and training, which on its face might be an okay thing, might lead people into a much more unregulated sort of Wild West of a sort of market, right? I mean, and then you end up with sort of things like traps that, again, if there's no federal oversight, we're relying on individual states to do right by students and borrowers. So sort of bringing how all of this sort of I think fits together in a pretty worrisome way. So just a couple more questions before we sort of wrap up here. I think we're talking a little bit about states, but like obviously I think everyone here acknowledges that we do need to eventually rebuild federal oversight, not to mention sort of the hopefully reinvest in programs that we're now disinvesting from. But obviously several provisions of the recent reconciliation bill, whether that's workforce Pell, loan limits, as Aisa mentioned, there's a pretty substantial potential gain for private actors, lenders, boot camps, programs, for-profit colleges, right, at a time when that oversight is being dismantled. But at some point we have to rebuild it, right? So, $64,000 question to you all, like what does a rebuilt system of federal oversight look like if and when we get that opportunity? Does it look, broadly the same as it did, in December of 2024, or is it something different? Like, do we need to reimagine sort of the way we think about oversight, differently now? Again, big question, but y'all are the smart people that I want to listen to. So,
I'm happy to start. I've been really thinking and reflecting about how quickly this administration has really been able to just impose such damage across our federal government. And I think a large part of what gave them the political cover to do this is the fact that they tapped into a long distrust and dissatisfaction of everyday people with their government. The fact that, many folks felt like their government was just not looking out for them and was not trying to just make their lives better. Now, whether this was true or not, whether or not, that is a whole different conversation for a whole different other day, right? But I think that that was a very real sentiment that this administration has tapped into. And look at what they've done in 9 months. Like, it's just truly insane. And so for me, when I'm thinking about reimagining what this new oversight system looks like, I mean, we absolutely cannot rebuild to what it was December 2024. And we have to fundamentally remember that what we had, the system that was in place prior to this administration coming into office, it was already not working. We had, using some of Stephanie's examples, right? Like, we've had entire industries taking advantage of the lowest incomes, communities across our country, leaving them saddled with student loan debt, talking about the for-profit college industry, right? That through the current oversight system had been able to continue to operate, had to continue to bankroll off of federal financial aid, right? And leaving students with mountains of student loan debt. We've had servicers who continue to get contracts from the federal government and consistently and systemically fail to do their jobs. So I think my number one goal in reimagining what we rebuild once we have the opportunity to do so is, number one, we should not allow our federal government to contract with entities that fundamentally cannot do their jobs and are, leaving folks further and further in debt. So that's my number one idea. Number two, I think whatever this oversight system looks like in the future, it must be borrower centered or people centered. And I'm thinking of one tangible example, that SBPC, and I'm so proud of the team for pulling this together. Earlier this year, when we really saw this administration kind of taking a chainsaw to, well, yes, literally a chainsaw was involved, to major aspects of our government, we knew that we had to think creatively about how to get borrowers access to information and, get help, because we saw the CFPB being completely gutted and massive number, more than half of their staff fired. We saw the same exact thing at the Department of Education. And so we created the, Protect Borrowers casework tool, which was, in the grand scheme of things, seems like such a small little thing, but it was a tool to help constituents navigate, or borrowers navigate, the constituent casework process. And this was something that has, that members of Congress pride themselves in their casework abilities, regardless of their party affiliation. But it was really an underutilized tool for student loan borrowers to navigate their issues with their servicer or their issue with their Department of Education and, their student loans. And the feedback that we've been getting from borrowers or from folks working in legal aid is that this casework tool and this tool in the toolbox was the only thing that was getting borrowers tangible results. And so for me, that just tells me, whatever this future oversight looks like, we can't be afraid to really empower individual congressional offices to do oversight that actually leads to tangible positive impacts for people. And we just cannot forget that whatever system is built, it has to improve people's lives in some way and value people over the institutions that, have just failed for way too long.
Novel concept. Stephanie, Candace, first of all, same question to you all. What does oversight look like now? But also, what's the best and most effective way to sort of talk about the need for that oversight, right? I think, obviously, you talked about sort of the principles undergirding it, right? But obviously we're going to have to be able to, let people know why this is needed, right? So sort of what does it look like, and how do we think about telling that story to borrowers and advocates and families.
Yeah, and we didn't bring up a lot of the accountability stuff that's in the one big ugly law, but without intervention, we're basically welcoming a decade-long free-for-all by education profiteers. And I know that sounds hyperbolic or dramatic, but my view from focusing on the business models in higher ed is that the profit motive is fundamentally at odds with public higher ed and at odds with federal student aid programs. And I think we need to reckon with that. I think how do we talk about it though? Like there are human impacts. It's not just on the borrower who feels it immediately, but eventually this will dwindle down to impacting your neighbors who are seeking medical care or other services, because we are looking at a contraction in the availability of higher ed training programs that are essential for the well-being of society. When we look at the different parts of this bill and how it could impact the availability of higher ed. So I think we need to talk about that human impact. And on a positive note, I'm optimistic that we could also, frame this as how do we intervene before it's too late, before we have essential programs collapsing. And maybe that, maybe we need increased public investment. And with that investment, we could overlay better oversight.
I echo and retweet what Stephanie and I used to say. Like, I don't know if there's much for me to add, except for how we tell the stories. Like, we get creative. Like, we see how Dan's telling the story. He's, why we're here today. We get creative and we tell the stories of borrowers and on a deeper level, not just how the financial impacts, the emotional, the familial impacts, and how it's impacting everyone on different levels. And we use our resources, our connections to tell the story through research and advocacy, litigation, whatever we have to do to tell the story. That's how we also do that.
I don't think I have anything to add to that. I think that's actually a really good place for us to end, right? Telling the story in creative ways and talking about the impact that's not just in a sort of monthly statement, but in the sort of broader, in the broader context of people's lives, right? So with that, I'm going to use my sort of moderator privilege to close us out. First of all, I want to thank Dan Collier again. For folks who aren't familiar with Dan's work, he's all over the place, but one place you can go is slli.org. That's the Student Loan Law Initiative website. He's got some briefs up there that really dive into some of the stuff he was talking about today. I know there's oncoming research, and we'll be sure to share that out with the relevant channels. And thank you to Candace and Stephanie and Aisa for shepherding us through what I'm going to use Persis' thing again, the utter chaos and disarray, I think was the phrase she used. So thank you for making it not disarray for everyone. So thanks for joining us, to those who do it live. Thanks for those who are joining the recording. And thank you to all you do to help make lives better for people with student debt and working families. And with that, we'll give everyone the rest of the day. Thanks.
Thank you all.